minutes for the panel. And the format of the panel is we'll have Empu go first, making a brief introduction of the topic. And then we have each panelist talk about for about 10 minutes about the topic and sharing their thoughts about this topic. And then we'll open the floor for Q&As, and Empu and I would moderate the discussion and the Q&A session. And finally, if you have questions as we go, feel free to enter them in the Zoom chat box. So next, Empu, I'll pass on to you.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Thanks you all for coming. And again, Tony and I are delighted to have our eminent panelists today. And we look forward to an exciting session today. As we all know, corporate strategy is about how managers set and oversee the scope of their firms. It can be summarized into three broad buckets. How managers coordinate resources within the boundaries of the firm. How they develop relationships with other companies across the boundaries of the firm. And how they decide which of these businesses should be within the boundaries and which ones perhaps shouldn't be within the boundaries. Now, platform-based businesses relate to all these three topics in corporate strategy. Platform owners often build extensive resources and capabilities within the boundaries to orchestrate the participation of complementers. They maintain vertical and horizontal relationships with other platforms outside complementers and non-platform firms as well. Platform owners also actively make decisions on what businesses should be within the platform, and sometimes, outsource part of these diversification to the complementers in the platform as well. So obviously, this leads to a broader question on how we leverage many years of research in corporate strategy to better understand the platform-based businesses. For example, platform work has often highlighted the non-hierarchical and non-contractually bound relationships platforms have with their complementers. It gives complementers a lot of leeway to stay or leave the platform at their discretion. So how do we think about this within the broader realm of corporate strategy? Here, it might be helpful for us to look at how business partnerships were incorporated into the corporate strategy research. In 1980s and 1990s, as business partnerships such as strategic alliances and joint ventures became a prevalent phenomenon, corporate strategy has expanded its scope to include coordination of resources across the firm boundaries, not just limiting itself to within the firm boundaries as it used to do. So platform businesses with their found fuzzy boundaries and non-hierarchical relationships can also possibly be incorporated in the mainstream corporate strategy research in a similar manner with expanding the scope of corporate strategy. Now, there is also an obvious important question: how do we expand the existing theory of corporate strategy? I mean, consider organizational governance mechanisms, for instance. Some of the well-known governance mechanisms, such as ownership structures and decision rights, continue to be important in platform-based business models. However, they might manifest in different forms. For instance, traditionally, we know decision rights are important for a range of outcomes, such as firm performance, R&D, and innovation. But here in platforms, decision rights could do additional features as well. For example, how they are allocated could affect the way transactions between both sides of the market are realized or not. On the other hand, we also see the emergence of relatively new forms of governance mechanisms, such as design tools relating to platform access control or algorithmic governance tools such as smart contracts. For example, platform access control provides platform owners with the ability to grant, restrict, and revoke the market access to complementers, depending on the collective interests. Platform phenomenon also scales up the importance of some core aspects of corporate strategy literature. One such example is the notion of complementarity. Different types of complementarities we see in platform context include direct and indirect network effects, matching, co-specialization, and supermodularity, which can improve our understanding of organizational design and classical corporate strategy more broadly as well. So with that, I warmly welcome all of you again to our panel, and let me hand it back to Tony. Thank you very much.
Sorry, it takes me 5 seconds to unmute myself. So thank you, Ebru. So next, we have the first presenter, Gary Dushnitsky. Gary, can you share your screen?
Great, thank you very much. Can you see the screen? Yeah, perfect, great. So thank you guys for organizing this, and it's really nice to see so many familiar faces and names. It's actually it's nice to have this conversation. So very much looking forward to it. We only have 10 minutes, and so what I'll try to do is just give you a bit of a teaser in terms of the way that I've been thinking about some of these issues. I think we've had an excellent summary right now. And what I would like to do is I would like to basically touch on two studies, if you wish, that attempted getting at these questions in two different directions. The first paper I'll talk about really looks at the strategic choices that platform takes and the mix thereof as they're thinking about which businesses and complementers to have on the platform, yes and no. This study takes place in the context of transaction platforms, which we often tend to call marketplaces. And specifically, it looks at crowdfunding, which are marketplaces for funding. Then in the second half, I'll talk a little bit more about platform organization, and I'll have that conversation in the context of innovation platforms, some of the work that we tend to talk about in the context of developing ecosystems. And this one will touch or will be based on an empirical study of incumbent startup relationships. So if I just focus on the first one, which is based on a paper that was recently accepted at SMJ, maybe let me start off with a motivating quote. And by the way, this SMJ special issue was edited by Toby and maybe even a few of his co-editor amongst the names. So let me maybe just start with a bit of a example. Consider the Swedish platform Funded by Me that we're looking to do what every platform attempts to do to increase its customer base and generate network effects. And if you were to scratch your head, which side of the market should we go first? Should we subsidize those who seek capital? Should we subsidize those who are actually providing capital? We can ask this question time and again. What this platform actually did is something much simpler. They translated the platform to English. And overnight, the scope of participant has grown dramatically. And for us, that calls attention to the issue of managing accessibility that was mentioned at the opening. Language is one clear way in which platforms determine what type of people, if you wish, or what audiences will be potentially allowed on the platform. What products are allowed? Do we allow all products, only medical products, and so on and so forth? That's another choice platforms make. What services do we provide? Do we allow for matching? Do we do vetting behind the scene? Do we offer additional, do we bundle in additional services? As well as some of the more traditional pricing strategies that you might be familiar with, whether it's in terms of subscription fees, transaction fees, and what side of the market should be allocated. When you take a look at that, you see that there are hundreds of possible combination of strategy mixes that platforms may actually pursue. And what we wanted to do, and we do that in the context of crowdfunding platforms, is study how do platforms decide which complementers to bring on board and how do they mix the strategic choices. And so we have data on the population of almost 800 crowdfunding platforms in Europe over the last 20 years. And we look at the combination of the strategic choices using cluster analysis. A couple of really interesting patterns emerge. The first insight is that platforms do not adopt those strategies in isolation. They actually create a mix of pricing and non-pricing strategies that is supportive of their overall goals and ideally maximize their performance. And so if I make this slightly more concrete, we find that among the financial crowdfunding platforms, lending and equity crowdfunding platforms, they have a go wide strategy. They set up high fees upfront to make sure that they screen away the lemons. And then they allow you to choose whether it's a music-based project, a video game-based project, a housing project, and so on and so forth. This is very different than non-financial crowdfunding platforms, which go deep. They are trying to create a community of like-minded people. They invite you to come in and browse through only video games, only art performers, and they only charge a fee when and if you transact. It shows how the strategy mix actually that they take is actually different. There's some nice infographics that we can share. And so in conclusion, what we find is that when we look at the population of crowdfunding platforms, we find evidence that platforms are very specific in terms of the mix of strategies that they put together. And had we had more time, I would also go into some of the analysis we do in terms of the performance implications thereof. How do I do on time? No idea. Okay, so I'll keep going. Just the
Sorry, 4 minutes.
4 minutes, perfect. The second study looks at how do platforms organize, and specifically we do that in the context of ecosystems, specifically looking at the incumbent startup relationship. And this is a study along with one of my doctoral students, Sukun Kang, one of the brightest students I've had a chance to work with. I believe he's on the call here, so you can ask him tough questions. The phenomena here is very simple. If you look at, here's just one example. If you look at Autodesk, which is a company for design, architecture design, when they came up with a software that allows to do 3D printing, they have explicitly taken action to orchestrate the ecosystem around it. And at the same time that they released Spark, their software, they also engaged in a systematic strategy to invest and sponsor startups that are building on and creating value around this 3D printing community. And so what we have here is we have a study that attempts to ask a question or attempt to understand how is it that companies build and integrate or orchestrate, if you wish, resources. And I defer here to work by Ron and Connie and others who have talked about we have capabilities for sensing what happens, but separately from that, we also have capabilities for orchestrating and integrating an ecosystem. And the idea here is that we go beyond passively tracking and sensing to explicitly shaping and coordinating those partners. And so what we do is we basically assembled a large sample of over 1,500 different corporate investors. We looked at why and how do they engage with the startups. And what we've seen is that over the last 10, 15 years, what you see this growth pattern, if you wish, post 2010, is that the number of incumbents that explicitly engage with startup with an orchestration logic has been growing. I'm going to skip some of the specifics over there. Basically, what we find is that incumbents reach out to innovative startups to not just to learn about technologies from them, but to coordinate and build an overall ecosystem. We find that the ability to actually create and capture value is a function, A, of the number of participants that they've fostered, as well as the intensity of the interaction between them. And we think that this gives us a further insight into the way in which companies actually build up this ecosystem. With that, I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary. So I'll move on to PK Toh, and I believe PK is going to talk about the scope of the ecosystem or platforms.
Gary, would you mind? Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
1 second, sorry. All right. Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Right. So thank you, Tony and Anpu, for organizing this session and for having me here. So today, over the next 10 minutes, I'm going to present a working project, a very early stage working project with my co-author Cameron Miller from Syracuse. So this is meant to be this is meant to be a conceptual paper, and neither Cameron nor I actually have any experience in writing conceptual paper. So it's quite a learning experience for us. And so we're still in the midst of putting pieces together, and things are not quite fully worked out yet. But I thought I would present this, given that it's quite central to one of the themes of this symposium that Anpu was mentioning earlier about the scope of the firm, the boundaries of the firm within ecosystem. So the title of this working project is Complementarities Capture Theory of the Firm in Ecosystem. Okay, so the typical, when we mention the word platform-based ecosystem, the typical depiction that comes to mind is that the platform owner and the complementers are different entities. Right? So the depiction is that the platform owner always have the incentive to try to draw more complementers onto the platform, and that there should be 1,000 blooming complementers experimenting on the platform so as to facilitate the growth of the platform. And so there's a term called generative properties of the platform, basically reflecting this idea that the platform in the ecosystem allows for a lot of participation from different types of complementers. So that's the general depiction. But if you look at the reality, right? So in reality, the platform owner, or rather the complements, doesn't have to be separate entities than the platform owners. In fact, the platform owner often subsequently integrate into the complementary space. So some of the well-known current examples are Amazon integrating into third-party supply space, Apple integrating with its own apps into various spaces in the app space, in the complementary app space. In fact, this is raising quite a bit of concerns in real life, right? So a lot of the, for example, EU is launching an antitrust investigation into Amazon to see if their integration into the complementary space constitutes unfair practice in some ways. And the Apple one's interesting, right? So a lot of the apps developers are complaining that Apple is actually using the apps, using data about the apps and from the apps to learn about the underlying app space, underlying complementary space, and then subsequently introducing its own app. And this own app has access to Apple's iOS, certain parts of the iOS platform that the other competing complementers do not, right? So this is a real problem, and this real phenomenon is not just happening in platform-based ecosystem. So we tend to see the platform-based ecosystem, right, because they are very prominent, but actually there are non-platform-based ecosystems that are quite large out there as well, right? So we see platform-based ecosystem as a special case of an ecosystem in general. Right? So in these non-platform-based ecosystems, there are multiple owners of the so-called platform, right, or the core components within this ecosystem. And in these non-platform-based ecosystem, usually coordination is done using standard setting. Right? So some of my ongoing work with Cameron, we've shown that actually a lot of these owners, the platform owner, if you will, owners of the core components, are actually integrated into the complementary space as well. Right? So this is a very real phenomenon. The question is why? What is driving these, I'm going to call them platform owners for simplicity. What is driving platform owners' integration into complementary space? Of course, there are lots of theories of the firm that we should go to right away, right? So TCE, property rights, KBB. I'm going to grossly simplify what each theory says in the interest of time. But the point I'm trying to get to is that we don't think these theories are fitting very nicely in the ecosystem context. Hopefully I can convince you, right? Let me try to explain that simply. So for TCE, the idea is this: for the supplier to transact with the buyer, the supplier will need to invest in some kind of asset-specific investments, but is hesitant to do so because it's worried that the buyer is going to be opportunistic and hold up the supplier subsequent to investments. Hence, integration as a solution. Property rights. In order for the supplier to transact with the buyer at the optimal level, the supplier actually needs to exert a certain level of effort, types of effort. But because of a breakdown in the market contract and the incentive misalignments that follows, the supplier is not going to invest in the optimal level of effort necessary. So, solution, integration. Okay. KBB is similar, right? So KBB is to say that in order for supplier to transact with the buyer, okay, the supplier needs to move certain types of knowledge across and apply it across firm boundaries into the buyer's operations, or vice versa, of course. And this cross-firm boundaries application, for some reason, creates some complications. Hence, integration as a solution. You see, across these theories, one of the common traits is that there needs to be some kind of transaction between the buyer and supplier. The supplier's output acts as a form of input into the buyer's operations in some ways. And there's a contract for them to govern this kind of transaction. But as Rahul Kapoor nicely points out in his 2018 paper, one of the key traits that makes ecosystem different from a typical industrial organization, such as vertical value chain, is that there is there's a lack of a typical buyer-supplier relationship there. Right? So because of that, these theories don't really fit in well, because between the platform owner and the complementers, they're not really buyer-supplier. Right? Of course, we can use some typical theories of diversification, Penrosian theories, for example. We can think of platform owners' integration into the complementary space as a form of diversification, right? And then we'll start diving deeper and think about all the reasons that drive this kind of diversification, how fungible the resources are, how redeployable, whether by diversifying, you can create some kind of intra or intertemporal economies of scope, right? But the issue with, of course, this kind of theory would work, but it is not really specific. There's nothing about ecosystem that's coming into play in this kind of explanations. So we think that there's something different at work here, something that's derived from a particular properties of the ecosystem. And we're going to call it Complementarities capture theory of the Fermi ecosystem. Simple idea is the following. So there's a platform and there's a complement. Platform's investments adds complementarity to the complement. So what the platform does raises the value of the complements. Right? So the green part of the box is meant to reflect the increased value. Now, in a typical, say, vertical chain, where there's buyer-supply relationship, now the platform owner does not have to integrate into the complements in order to capture this increased value that it helped create. Because there's a transaction, there's a contract in place, right, that allows the platform owner to bargain with the complementer. But as we said earlier, one of the key traits of an ecosystem is that this kind of buyer-supply transactions doesn't really exist, or at least exists in very different forms. And so once we have a breakdown in these contractual abilities to capture this increased value, now the platform is now investing in things to increase the value of complements that itself cannot have easily appropriate. Right? Hence, integration as a solution to capture the complementarity value that's created elsewhere in the complementary space. That's the kind of the core idea. Right? So if we line up this in the following sentence, the platform owner integrates into complementary space when it's I cannot see my screen, sorry. When its investments in platform adds complementarity value to complements, but it lacks contractual means to appropriate this value via market. Now we can split this sentence into different parts and dive in and then start to derive hopefully testable propositions from it. Let's focus on this part. The platform owner's investments in the platform adds complementarity value to the complements, right? So we can think of complementarities as one-way or two-way, as Baldwin has nicely pointed out. Now, within the one-way complementarities, you can further split that into outbound, meaning that the platform's investments, platform owner's investments increase the value of the complement, or inbound, the complement's existence increase the value of the platform. So this theory works more for outbound, the outbound complementarities. Right. So if it's inbound, if it's just complements adding the value to the platform, then the platform owner is totally fine, doesn't have to integrate. The problem arises when it's outbound, right? And there's no easy way for the platform owner to capture this value. So a testable proposition is that the greater the net outbound complementarity, the more likely the platform owner will integrate into complementary space. There are lots of assumptions and simplifications going on here. We can tweak that and derive different types of propositions. I won't have time for that. And then
1 minute, PK.
Oh my gosh, okay, quickly, right? We zoom into the second sentence, which is the contractual means, right? The lacking contractual means. And then we can figure out how generic or how specific the contracts are in this platform-based ecosystem. Right? When the platform-based is, when the contract is generic between platform owner and complementers, and if there are variants in the value that's created on the complementary space, that creates a situation where there are excess value created by the platform owner in the complementary space that the platform owner cannot capture. Right? So the more generic the contract between platform owners and complementers, the more likely we will see integration by the platform owner. We have some corroborating evidence so far in published recent papers or ongoing work. I'm going to say them really quickly. In the SMJ special issue coming out, essentially we're showing that the platform owner is increasing the value of the complements. In the SMJ paper in 2017, we are showing that the platform owner actually, prior to coordinating its core platform technologies, has already integrated into complementary space. In a working paper with Shiva Agarwal from a colleague at UT Austin, we are seeing complements as real options for the platform owner to learn and assess the underlying complementary space to decide if you should subsequently integrate into complementary space. And finally, I have a working project with Cameron that shows how integration happens throughout ecosystem evolution. Specifically, the pattern looks something like this. Look at the graph on the left. The concentration ratio of firms within complementary space, there's a very stark pattern that's going on there. The concentration ratio is really rising as the ecosystem evolves in the complementary space. And on the graph on the right, we see that a lot of it is coming from the platform firms itself. The platform firms is integrating into these things. I don't think I have time for behavioral assumption. I'm just going to step back and say, that's kind of the core idea. And of course, the next step is to tighten some of the logic and formulate more testable hypotheses and hopefully actually conduct some empirical tests. That's it from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, PK. Thanks very much for the presentation. I really like the idea that you are bringing theories of organizational economics into the space. So next, we are going to have Tobias talk about meta organizations, the new term that they create.
Excellent. Okay, can you all hear and see me?
Yes.
So that's great. Perfect. Thank you. So I took my job very literal, and given it's about platforms, scale, scope, and organization, I wanted to kind of close the close the circle here to talk about the organization of platforms, in particular the meta organization of platforms, and how this relates to the strategies that these firms, that platforms and platform ecosystems are likely to implement. Interesting. Okay. So if we think of platforms as an organizational form, so of course, I'm preaching to the converted when I say that platform business models have now really made inroads in pretty much any sector of the economy. There's guides and articles on the platformization of businesses and so on. So clearly, there's something going on. Now, if we take the two extremes, should we be thinking of platform markets? Because in the end, platforms facilitate transactions, and transactions are really the name of the game in platform markets. But maybe that's not quite appropriate, because platforms here act as a go-between, and they actively manage the different sides of the market. So there's something more going on than just a marketplace. On the other hand, is it appropriate to think of platform businesses? So in a corporate strategy kind of sense, because clearly the platform owner actively manages the platform. He exerts control, or it exerts control over the complementers. But, and that's cycling back to what we just heard, of course, the scale and especially the scope decisions are not necessarily controlled by the platform itself, but rather there are options, there's a certain degree of flexibility on the part of complementers to choose their scope and their particular varieties of complements. Now, if we wanted to boil that down and think about where value gets generated on a platform or in a platform ecosystem, it's clear that the value depends both on the base product, the platform itself, and on the ecosystem around it. And so the question really is, what's the right unit of observation here, and how should we think about that unit of observation? So luckily, there's a paper which is basically the introduction to the special issue that both PK and Gary have been referring to. And in that, we refer to platforms as organization of organizations, in other words, meta-organizations. And so I want to just briefly share our view on that. So how do we organize a platform ecosystem? Well, we can think of the kind of standard organization design features and how specifically platforms try to resolve these issues, right? So everyone knows that when we think about organization design, we need to think about where authority comes from. And in a hierarchical organization, it comes from the ownership of assets. Now here on platforms, authority comes from the fact that the platform owner exerts and contains architectural control in setting the technological parameters and the standards that are then set the scene for complementers to do their thing on. Authority also comes from achieving coordination across complementers and the platform. In other words, if there are complementarities that exist between complementers, then this is something that typically, is managed by the platform rather than the complementers themselves. And authority also comes from the right, or the residual right, to cut out a complementer from participating on the platform or inviting complementers in. Now, second, we talk about incentives. Incentives clearly are typically steeper on a platform than in a hierarchical firm. Complementers, in organization economics terms, are the residual claimant of their action, right? So more quality of a particular complement will result in higher payoffs to the complementers. And combined with that, motivation, another important element of organization design, comes from giving complementers wide-ranging autonomy and participation choices. So here again, we're slightly more flexible than in a hierarchy. Now, talking about governance and coordination structures, these are influenced by who adds which kind of value on the platform, right? Which participant adds which kind of value. So the platform owner retains the rights on the technical systems and the transaction systems, kind of as we alluded to in the first point, where authority comes from. Whereas the complementers retain decision rights on their own efforts. So you can think of this as maybe a development pack that's being issued by the platform. That's kind of the technical system or the transaction system, whereas complementers decide what to make of it. This actually enables the platform to have a broader span of control than in a typical hierarchy. So why does that not? Why don't we just organize platforms as a market or hierarchy? So Van der Steen, in an AR article in 2000, suggests that the one important driver of the optimal organizational form is the structure of interdependencies. So on the one hand, network effects would call for integration, right? So we have actions that cross-affect each other. So you would want some integration. And there are certainly some elements of integration here. The platform retains architectural control. It retains sort of the constraint to exclude some participants. On the other hand, platforms often rely on being or on having a dynamic and having a very wide-ranging heterogeneous ecosystem, and that requires some degree of interdependence that looks more like a market. So these are reflected in giving steep incentives to complementers, giving autonomy to complementers, and by aligning decision rights with the residual claimancy. So this is kind of the central table of our paper, where we use on the in the lines here, we use sources of power and authority, motivation, participation, and governance and coordination, and discuss different aspects of competition, namely platform entry. So what does a platform do when they enter a market in which there is a classical or a conventional incumbent? what happens if platforms compete with each other, and how do these three aspects of org design affect within platform competition. So just to highlight a few here, of course, in the interest of time. When it comes to a new platform entering a market with an existing incumbent, the point is to create a technological and/or relational hub to make sure that there can be coordination across these complementers, which in turn makes it more attractive for complementers to join, maybe setting or enabling modularity and loose coupling to allow autonomy on the part of the part of the participants, but at the same time managing or achieving these benefits from coordination. If we went further down, of course, within platform competition, this is usually between platform owner and complementer. When we talk about modes of governance and coordination, here it's about decentralizing decision rights to manage the cooperation and competition among these complementers. So to sum up, platforms are not a hierarchy, nor are they a market, but they carry elements of both. So it's somewhere in between. Now, as I hope to have convinced you, platform organization reveals some novel intermediate ways of addressing key questions surrounding authority, incentives, and governance. And how platforms are organized, and that was what the last table was about, how they are organized may affect the way that they compete, how they compete with incumbents, how they compete with each other, and how competition on platforms itself happens. So I would close by saying that there's clearly more research needed to make sure if platforms are really a bona fide own organizational form, and how they differ from other hybrid organizational forms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tobias. It's really interesting that you're showing some strong connections between platforms and organizational design. We appreciate it. So last, we are going to have Connie share some general thoughts on this topic.
Okay, it's great to see you guys all here. Even if some of you are probably doing something else because you've got your screens, so I can't actually see you. So I don't have slides. I'm going to do sort of a more typical IG thing where I have some notes. And so I'm going to just sort of go through a series of topics, traditional topics in corporate strategy, and suggest some ways that we might think about them in the context of platforms. And then at the end, I'll talk about a couple of things I've been thinking about for a while, some of which were already mentioned, that I think would be interesting to push on. And the perspective I'm going to take is actually the traditional perspective in corporate strategy of a firm, rather than the perspective of the platform ecosystem, right? And a lot of my remarks, I'll talk about the platform leader as example, but a number of the things will apply to complementers in particular, okay? Because I think our tendency is to think about corporate strategy for the leader, but of course, complementers offer multiple products, you know, they have suppliers, things like this. Sometimes complementers become platform leaders, which is another interesting thing to think about. So, so let's think about some traditional topics here. The big one, we think corporate strategy, what would you all say? You'd say related, unrelated diversification. That would probably be topic number one, right? You know, these are driven by economies of scope for related diversification. You know, so we could think about a few of these. And I want to actually flag a recent paper by Annabelle Gower that just came out in Long Range Planning, where she talks about some of these issues of scope. So if you're interested in this, I would really urge you to read the paper. It's quite nicely done. But one point she makes is, you know, if we're thinking about economies of scope, we're thinking about multi-product firms. And this is something that Gary brought up, is that some firms offer sort of transaction-based services, and some are offering innovation-based products, right? And some platforms and firms actually have both, right? So platform leader is putting together a set of products or services that are both transaction and innovation based, right? So that's a form of multi-product organization that we could think about. The other thing we could think about for economies of scope are what are the shared assets, right? I mean, I'm really surprised we haven't seen more attention to this, right? I mean, Amazon just seems to me to be like the poster child for this, right? I mean, what assets are they sharing, right? You know, well, there's knowledge, there's software, you know, so one question occurs to me is, are platforms inherently are these firms going to be broader in the types of products that they host, right? You know, think about this, you know, Amazon's in every kind of retailing you could think of, and AWS, right? So I think we could actually think about the fungibility of the assets and the knowledge, right? And so some of this actually goes back to what Anpu said at the very beginning in his excellent summary, right? You know, again, walking through a lot of the things that Anpu said, how about acquisitions, right? You know, we can think about, you know, selecting acquisitions, you know, executing them. A big question in acquisitions is post-acquisition integration. You know, I mean, one thing that occurs to me is, well, you know, if, you know, a lot of times, this goes back to what PK is saying, sometimes the platform leaders are actually buying, you know, they're going into the complementary services. Sometimes they're doing this by acquisition. Is this easier for information-based platforms, right? The post-acquisition integration, you're bucketing on products, right? You are not integrating the whole thing into your organization necessarily. You might be able to do it, you know, in a much slower fashion, right? So that's another thing we could look at. Some of these traditional product problems might be simpler when you have these information-based products and platforms. Another question we typically see in corporate strategy is alliances, right? And I think about, actually, when you start thinking about platforms and platform leaders, you really have to start thinking about portfolios of alliances, right? I mean, when you're putting together all these partnerships, that's what these relationships with complementers are. They all have to work together, right? This is not, I have one-off partner here, one-off partner there, right? And, you know, this is because of the indirect network effects and the multi-sided part of these platforms, right? So again, you have to think about, how does this work, right? What is different in how we organize these kinds of platform products and all these partnerships together? And then that brings me to thinking about complementers. I mean, where have we seen this before? Well, David Teese, in his 2018 article in Research Policy, was very happy to point out that we've seen this before in complementary assets, right? You know, so one type of complementary asset is complementary technology, right? So you see this a lot in the innovation-based platforms, right? The app providers, PK mentions standard settings, it comes in here. But if we think about the complementers, you know, I mean, we can start thinking actually about TCE here, right? So this is something that Kevin Boudreau mentioned in his advances paper. It came up in actually my paper with Ruth Robichek on the integrative capabilities that was mentioned earlier. Because if you think about it, you know, when you're platform leader and you're putting together all the products that you're going to offer on your platform, right? The transaction costs, there are transactions costs of putting these products on your platform, right? And they're endogenous, right? The way the platform leader structures these relationships, you can structure it to bring down the costs. So that's part of what the integrative capabilities are. That reduces the transaction cost. That means you can lower, you can make the boundary of the firm narrower, right? by having more external complementers at the same time as you make the boundary of the platform ecosystem broader, right? So these are all things we can think about. And then finally, in terms of sort of more traditional topics, I think we could think about org design and org structure in a narrower sense, I think, than Toby was talking about, and that Toby's done a lot of work on. So I think this is really interesting. How are these platform leaders and the complementers structured to make this work, right? I mean, so I think Google, you see, and a lot of this is because they're IT companies, right? But think about Google's got this internal market for software engineers, where that's how these team-based projects are taking place. You know, again, this is a much different way of running and coordinating your organization. That, again, it would be great to study this, right? Because I think you've got a natural platform. Sorry about the term for doing. Okay, so just a couple things that I'm interested in terms of thinking about all this, which is an awful lot of stuff. So first of all, what are the capabilities to manage all this, right? I mean, you're not surprised to hear me say that. So, you know, so one thing that Ampu flagged up front is the need for coordination. I've talked about integrative capabilities, in particular, how you manage your, integrating all these providers onto your platform, right? That's something that the leader does. I obviously have written about this in my, my paper. I think a key thing there is that network effects are not automatic, and people sort of forget about that, right? It's in the background, right? Platform leaders actually have to set this up. They need capabilities not only to get the network effects going, but to keep them going. They will devolve. You've got competitors coming after you. You need to innovate. All this requires constant attention and capability, which I call an integrative capability, to bring this together. So I think we could think more about what happens over time, right? You know, this is not a static situation. And so that brings me to my last point, which is I think that the evolution of scope is an interesting topic. It's something I'm obviously interested in at my work on resource redeployment that then Tim and others have picked up on in a wonderful way. But I think we could think about it in platforms. They're a natural, you know, venue. There's a lot of market entry and exit here. You know, the complementers, as was pointed out, you know, create real options, which is sort of the heart of resource redeployment, as Tim has pointed out. You can think about growth through acquisition, you know, as the platforms evolve over time. You know, in terms of resource redeployment, there are lots of examples. Netflix is the poster child for this, right? So I'll just leave it there. Hopefully this has given you sort of a broad overview of lots of things we can think about that not only bring corporate strategy into platforms, but things we can use platforms to push forward the study of corporate strategy.
Thank you so much, Connie. I'm taking a lot of notes, actually, to give me a lot of great ideas for future research. I believe our participants are all taking notes, and they haven't had time to enter their comments into the chat box. Now it's the time for the Q&As.
So maybe I'll start with the Q&A for all the panelists, if I can. In your personal view, Connie has already sort of mentioned her own view on this. What are the kind of topics you would personally like to see scholars exploring in this sort of a corporate platform interface? And what are the type of ways that you would like to see them approaching these questions?
Sorry, who are you addressing this to, Anpu? I missed the first part.
For all the panelists, but PK, you can start.
Oh, okay. So I'll just jump in then. So your question is what areas of research do I personally would like to see, right, or would like to work on? So I think, of course, there are many issues that can be studied in platform ecosystems or ecosystems in general. But to me, this phenomenon is a new one that's interesting and is different. Right? So I would like to see what's, you know, if we apply all the typical strategy questions onto the platform setting, and then we ask ourselves, what's different here? Right? So in terms of coordination, what kind of new coordination challenges arise in terms of firm scope, which is what I presented earlier? How is it different from what we already know in terms of resource redeployment, diversification, expansion? How is it, or alliances? How is that different, right? So I would like to see some of the key thing that makes it different and what new theories arise from that because of these differences.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump here straight away, because I agree. I mean, that's what, in a sense, we started doing in this review article when it came to organization design and how things are different for platforms. And I think that this is going to have a big impact on how firms do strategy, how platform ecosystems and platforms do strategy. And I think so far there's inklings, or there's small elements of issues that have been addressed, but really taking a fuller view on this, I think, is where I would see the most potential, kind of linking the organization design of platforms and the strategic options and the strategic behavior. And as you say, PK, I mean, the classical questions of corporate strategy applied to platforms and to their specifics of design would be, I think, super interesting.
Maybe just to chime in, I think I couldn't agree more with everything that was just said. Maybe the one thing I would like to call attention to is that when you look at platforms or platform-based businesses, I think actually they are power law distributed. We have Amazon and Apple, which have been studied excessively. And we have hundreds of platforms that your students start at the end of each class, that your students launch at the end of their MBAs. What happened to those platforms? I think that for us to better understand what is it that platforms, what are their shared resources? How do they organize? How do they strategize? How do they decide on scope? We need to be true to the fact that there's this power law distribution, and we need to understand those who have not survived, how did they play out? My sense is that that will give us as much traction on these great questions as maybe just focusing on the Amazons of the world.
We have a great question here from Debraj, just entering into the chat box. So the question here is, how does platform relate to global strategy or internationalization? I realize that there's been an emerging string of research connecting platforms and ecosystems to IB, and JT, I think JT's here. JT has been doing quite a bit of work in that area, and I think Steve is doing some research in that area too. So, so let's. So, what do you think? What do the panelists think about this question?
I can just jump in and say that I think this is an excellent question. One thing that we find in another study I haven't had a chance to mention is that platform-based businesses do not seem to be sensitive to the number of competitors in their country, but they do seem to be sensitive to the number of competitors using a similar business model across the globe. And so you start getting these nuanced differences that maybe depart from some of the traditional findings we've seen.
Yeah, maybe adding on to this, I think again we can take different perspectives on this. On the one hand, we can think of different platforms competing on a global sphere, basically. So that's kind of what I mean you have been doing in your study, Gary, where different geographical foci were able to coexist and compete with each other. I think the other thing that's really interesting is to think of individual platforms as possible enablers of globalization. So I'm thinking specifically of Upwork and these sort of online labor markets, which clearly are platforms, and they enable to somehow at least internationalize labor in many ways, and they might also therefore internationalize the way in which firms request labor and in which they try to be active on different parts of the world. So I think there's two elements at least to this.
So let's go through the other questions here. So Luz has a question for Connie specifically. Luz, can you elaborate your question a little bit if you could?
Yes, hello everyone. I just wanted to know, how do platform-based researchers call the joint value creation in these ecosystems, if they call them synergies, as corporate researchers do when talking about M&As or PMI? I mean, just how do they call that process of value creation altogether? Thank you.
So I'll also let the others chime in on this. I don't think they call them synergies, or if they are, that's not, traditionally in strategy, the term synergies is within the firm, right? And I think what you're talking about is between two or more parties. So I think joint value creation would be closer. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in on the panel.
Or complementarities. I think complementarities is probably a term that comes more from the world of econ, but my sense is that many platform researchers would use that.
Okay, thank you so much.
So next we have Anoop having a question for Tobias specifically.
Mm-hmm.
So Anoop, can you elaborate?
Yeah, it was a general question. Instead of looking at it as an intermediate form between market and hierarchy, is it something different, a different animal, not an intermediate form, but unique in a transformational sense?
Mm-hmm. That's a fantastic question, and that's exactly the question that I want to devote the next X number of years to, because this really is the first step of saying, well, we can take some elements of hierarchy, we can take some elements of markets, but there's a good chance that, or there's a possibility that it really is something fundamentally different. So I do not have the answer, but I think it's an amazingly interesting and important question.
You don't have the answer. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I mean, the thoughts in a sense were in my presentation when I tried to outline in what sense they have elements of hierarchy and elements of market. And I must admit that I was struggling with this a bit because I didn't find the analogies completely obvious or completely clear. So my initial thought is also that the other intermediate market forms like alliances and hybrid forms, they are different. They're a different quality than platforms. So if you ask me to make a speculative judgment now, I would say that they're probably something that truly is different.
Can I chime in, and can I say that maybe platforms are constellations of markets and constellations of alliances. In other words, it's not just one single market, or maybe not just one single alliance. It's a constellation of them. I think we have used actually that term in the alliance literature for quite a while, I think in the past. But clearly, they are different. The term alliance group or alliance constellation was not meant, for platforms, at least back then. So I'll move on. I think we have a few minutes left, according to Anna. We have 3 to 5 minutes left, because if we don't finish the platform will finish, for us, they would just end. So let me move on to Martin. So Martin is raising a great question about physical assets, and physical assets in particular, I would say, play a very important role especially in property right theory. And Martin, can you elaborate a little bit?
Yes, I mean, this is an area that I follow, but I do not know much. So just if it is completely off target, I apologize. When Connie was mentioning relatedness, it was also brought to my mind, typical thinking around scope, operational synergies, financial synergies, and so on. And one thing that they have been documented, I mean, at least in newspapers, much of the growth online sales come from companies' online platforms with huge physical assets in the last couple of months. And the reason that I brought the physical assets is part of the discussion is tend to, my sense is emphasize digital assets and digital platforms. But the physical assets are also important to some of these companies, and they have different properties. They tend to have high physical fixed cost. Their deployability is different. Their scalability is different. That might bring some advantages. That can also bring some constraints in terms of the operation scopes and both within platform and across platform competition. So that's why I wanted to get some sense what the panelists think about the role of physical assets in the platform businesses.
So maybe I'd start off by saying this is part of economies of scope. That's one way of thinking about it. I mean, look at Amazon. They have a ton of physical assets, all right, which people tend to forget, right? All those warehouses, right? So this is what Walmart has, right? The other thing that Walmart has is customer relationships that come from their physical stores. And you leverage those scope economies, you know. So I just think this is economies of scope front and center. That's one way of thinking about it. And they're absolutely critical, actually.
Well, I'm going to take the last question from Steve. So Steve, can you elaborate your question a little bit?
Once I find the mute button. I guess this one on transaction costs. Platforms tend to be the dominant players because they are bigger organizations than the two sides of the market. But I find them interesting in the sense that transaction costs are always sort of hypotheticals, and yet the charges of a platform in order to take part in it, either side, seem to be directly tied to the transactional costs between the suppliers and buyers on either side of the platform. It also seems to me that sort of limits this organizational scope, because if we're playing this intermediary role, if we move up or down the kind of classic idea of the value chain, we sort of eliminate this ability to live on the transactional costs of alternative means of transacting that particular business. So I wonder, as not an OD person, I kind of wonder what people might think of that. And I guess just parenthetically, it seems like a way to actually value transaction costs if we looked at platform roles within a larger market for goods and services that's not necessarily served only by a platform.
And jump in just on a small piece. I'm not sure I'm going to be addressing the entire comment that Steve raised. But earlier in my presentation, I kind of glossed through by saying that TCE, transaction cost, doesn't really apply as well to the ecosystem or platform setting. I'm kind of glossing through that just because of in the interest of time. If you think about it, right, let's say the platform owner and the complements. So is there still some kind of transaction? Yes, right? So the complements, like the apps, developers still have to develop the app, customize and fit it onto the platform, the iOS platform, for example. So there's still that it's not that there's no asset specific investments, but the question is to what extent can hold up happen? Of course, there's some instances where hold up can happen, but in the kind of ecosystem that I have in mind, a lot of times the hold up ability is muted, right? So for example, in standard setting, there are actually rules governing how the licensing rates can happen, can be set. Or even in the kind of platform owners, clear platform base, with say Apple, Amazon, the contract that allows and the specifications for the apps, for the developer complements to jump on are standardized. So I would say, strictly speaking, it's not that there's no TC in play here, but it's muted, not so much because of the lack of asset specific investments, but the lack of the ability to now hold up the ones who make the investment.
Okay, so I think we have to stop. Anna, has given me a signal that I have to stop, otherwise I'd be kicked out basically by the platform. So, and I hope we are not the only Sunday session that extends over time. And again, I want to thank everyone, especially the panelists, the attendees, for participating in this panel and spending extra time with us. And I hope that you are taking away some ideas for future research on this very important and fast evolving topic on platforms and corporate strategy. We'll see you again in the future.
And thanks to Tony and Ampu. It was great.
Thanks very much,
Thank you for
Connie.
joining.
Tony and Ampu.
Thanks to everyone.
Thanks. Cool.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, the meeting.
Bye, Anna.